Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm David Germano, and I'm going to be introducing today's speaker on behalf of the Contemplative Science Center and the Compassionate Care Initiative. And it's with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. James Austin, who will be talking today on the art and science of Zen meditation. Now, I'm sure he doesn't remember me from the distant past. I've seen him more recently, but I think like 2 decades ago, actually, I had the privilege of hearing a talk you gave in Vermont, if I remember correctly.
Wow.
And yeah, and that was a long time before I myself got involved in the area of contemplative studies and contemplative science. And I'm sure there's many other people whose lives Dr. Austin has touched over the years with his publications and his personal presentations. He's one of the early founders of the field of the neuroscientific study of the brain in relationship to especially long-term meditation training, which is the subject of his talk today. Now, he originally graduated from Harvard Medical School in 1948, and he has had a long and distinguished career in the field of neurology. While his early research was in clinical neurology, neuropathology, neurochemistry, and neuropharmacology, in 1974, when he was staying in Japan at a sabbatical at the Kyoto University Medical School, he began what was to be a lifelong focus on training in Zen meditation with Kobori Roshi, a Rinzai Zen master there in Kyoto. And his desire to integrate this personal experience and training in Zen meditation with his background in neuroscience led to a groundbreaking work a decade later, Zen in the Brain, which was published by MIT Press in 1998. It was a book that was awarded the Scientific and Medical Network Book Prize, and it was widely read and also broadly influential. And at this point, this was not the era when there was a book on contemplation and contemplative neuroscience every single day, it seems, anymore. But rather, this was really a very embryonic and kind of struggling field. And this was a landmark study that went a long way towards making this field respectable and set the foundation for it to gradually enjoy a rather exponential growth over the past 20 years. And Dr. Austin has followed this work with 5 other books on the subject, Zen Brain Reflections in 2006, Selfless Insight 2009, Meditating Selflessly 2011, Zen Brain Horizons 2014, and Living Zen Mindfully in 2016. Now, there's an article here that's kind of a review of the field, Zen in the Brain, and if anybody would like that, you could just email csc@virginia.edu, csc@virginia.edu, and we can send you a copy of it. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. James Austin to the University of Virginia to give this talk, and so please join me in offering him a warm welcome.
Well, thank you, David, for your warm introduction, and I'm delighted that your memory reaches back 20 years at least, because that's what remindfulness does, and thank you. Well, this is my second trip to visit the University of Virginia. The first was 50 years ago when I visited an old classmate of mine who happens to be an old friend of Mrs. Mooning here. So it's a pleasure to be back in a beautiful fall day in this wonderful campus. You may be wondering what the word Zen means and how it originated. Back in the old days, the Sanskrit word dhyana was the word for meditation at the time of the Buddha 2,500 or so years ago. And when the meditation school moved from India to China, the Chinese pronounced it Chana. They later shortened it to Chan. And when this meditation school of Chinese and Taoist and Confucian type meditation, when this moved to Japan, the Japanese pronounced it Zen. There's another way to describe what Zen is, and I've taken this brushwork as an example of what the ideogram might stand for. Because this is the ideogram for Zen in China and Japan. Can you see it all right from the back? An easy translation of this ideogram would be manifest oneness. And it's the kind of injunction and command to encourage everybody to be in your behavior a manifestation of the essential oneness of all nature and all the world. That's a non-dual kind of world image. Ordinarily, the world we inhabit is a world in which the self is inside this skin, and outside it is other. It's a basic biological premise. Even an amoeba must know the difference between the cell inside and the world outside, because otherwise it would engulf and liquefy its own boundary. And in our usual world, we do inhabit a very strong I, me, mine sense of self, and you know that you are really in the seat that you inhabit at the moment, and you know that everybody else is outside you. This is an invitation to view the world as though you were a visitor from outer space, in which you and the outside world are all part of the same phenomenon. So, manifest oneness. David Germano mentioned in his introduction that I started out in Kyoto in 1974, about 43 years ago by count. And this is the gateway to the sub-temple in Kyoto that I started at. It was founded, Daitakuji, it was founded in 1324, a long time ago. And the open gate through which you walk on these old stones leads to this small sub-temple. I started there by accident. Another classmate of mine gave me a book called Zen in the Art of Archery before I flew across the Pacific to go to Kyoto for an ordinary research sabbatical. And I didn't understand what the book's message was. I didn't really have any notion really of what Zen had to do with archery. But I was curious enough when I got to Kyoto to inquire where I might find out more about Zen. And it was in this irregular manner that I was introduced to a Zen master who fortunately introduced me to Zen meditation. And that's how the story begins for me. On the other hand, seated meditation had been known for millennia before that. This is a seal from Mohenjo-Daro, a major city in the Indus Valley civilization. And it illustrates, I think you can see, a platform on which a figure is meditating, and the arms are not down here in the cosmic mudra or other position. They're out more in the relaxed vipassana position. So So meditation has had a very long history in Asia, certainly, and its comments on how meditation improved the spiritual quest gradually filtered it through yoga into, when it reached China, gradually filtered into what I described as Chan and then Zen. Long, long history. About 1,000 years after the Buddha, or around 500 of the Common Era, this was one of the statues of the Buddha. The figure is interesting for several reasons. If you look carefully, you'll see that the eyelids are not completely closed, but that they're partially open, and so some light is still able to energize the brain. The figure is notable for its calmness. Up at the top, you're seeing not a top knot of hair per se, but rather the sculptor is suggesting that there has been an enlargement of the cranial contents, and that is in turn causing a protrusion called the Ushnisha. That's a sculptor about 500 years ago. If there were a sculptor today, and he wished to pursue the metaphor, it's possible that he might show an indentation in that region, or at least an indentation that was in the vicinity of the parietal lobe, simply to suggest that maybe what the Buddha was manifesting was a reduction in the egocentricity in which our parietal lobe plays a prominent role. Be that as it may, the prominent earlobes are designed to suggest that this was a person of privileged status, privileged caste. And this is not really just big earlobes. These are ears that have been pierced, and there is a big earring there, which was part of the custom of the time. But you had to be in the upper caste or the semi-nobility to show this. And that's what Siddhartha Gautama was, the son of a chieftain in what is now Nepal. And the legend has it that he set out on his spiritual quest because he was disturbed by what he saw when he ventured out of his privileged wall onto the streets. He saw a very sick person, a dead person, a dying person, and a monk who somehow, despite all of the problems of suffering in the world, still managed to maintain a calm demeanor. And it was this contrast that set him on his long spiritual quest when he was 29, which culminated 6 or 7 years later when he finally sat under a Bodhi tree at the base and meditated throughout a very long night, or at least for a very long period. So what else do we have that tells us of the ways artists have approached this topic? Well, I've already gone into some of the Taoist influences that resulted in this calligraphy. And we come now to a statue of Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma is a legendary figure who was a privileged monk in India and who is responsible for bringing Indian Buddhism into China by foot. He's shown here in a monastic garb, and this particular wooden statue was given to me when I visited a medical school in Japan, and I noticed it on a shelf in the room of the dean who I was invited to see. And I said, oh, as soon as I walked in, I said, oh, you have a Daruma statue. Daruma is the Japanese name for Bodhidharma. And he said, oh, you know Daruma. And I said, yes, I'm surprised to see a Bodhidharma statue in a medical school in the dean's office. And had I been more knowledgeable of the customs in Japan at the time, I would have not been quite so voluble, because I could not get out of that dean's office without this statue being presented to me as a gift. So you're seeing here a picture of a real statue that's about this tall that was carved in a single stroke, multiple times style by a Japanese sculptor in the last century. Why is this important? Well, for one thing, you're seeing quite a lot of white sclera. And the reason you're seeing the whites of the eyes so prominent is that Bodhidharma, allegedly, having meditated for 9 years in a cave, was troubled by the way it was easy to fall asleep while he was meditating. So what did he, as a serious meditator, do? Well, he reached up and detached both eyelids, upper and lower, on both sides, and cast them on the ground so all the light could get in and his eyes would stop drooping. That's the legend. But the other legend is equally interesting, because it was rumored then that the first Indian tea that was introduced to China grew on the spot where Bodhidharma's eyelids rested and took root there. And this is how tea allegedly came to China from India. Be that as it may, there's another reason for neuroscientists to be intrigued by the position of Bodhidharma's eyes. There's something else unusual about these eyes. They illustrate upgaze, namely, he's not looking out at the horizontal plane of vision, he's looking above the horizontal plane of vision. And you can see that simply because the sculptor put his black pupils higher up on both sides. So this is Bodhidharma looking up. There are a number of other intriguing suggestions, which we'll go into in the later part of this talk, illustrating that some of the lower pathways in the brain are responsible for representing the world in space above the horizontal. And here we see that Bodhidharma, in his standard meditating posture at least, is looking up above the horizontal and allowing these lower brain pathways to process whatever might be entering. So Bodhidharma and Dharma are part of our heritage. I brought along on this trip another reason for people being interested in Bodhidharma. Every child in Japan at one time or another has seen something like this. It's a toy Bodhidharma. You'll recognize that the orange color of the vestments is about the same. This is the same guy. And one of the reasons that the child is given these toys is to convey the notion in the culture that there is such a thing as resilience, at least in Japan. So you are not unique in having rooms on your campus that are resilient rooms. The process of being resilient is exemplified here by the phrase 7 times down, 8 times up. I can't give you the Japanese for this, but in English it's 7 times down, 8 times up, which means that even though you're battered down once by a bully or something, you bounce up. And the second time you're knocked down, you also bounce up, and so on ad infinitum. The message, don't let the get you down. And children in Japan grow up with this notion that they need to be resilient in order to survive. This is another example of how old Buddhism has infiltrated a culture in some surprising ways. In the 13th to 14th century, there was a Japanese Buddhist nun whose name is Chiyono. And this is a woodcut from a couple centuries ago, illustrating what event happened in Chiyono's life in the 13th century or so. She was in the Zen style of meditation, had a Chinese Zen teacher, and she went out one dark night. At night, you can tell it's night because there's the moon, the white round harvest moon up in the sky. And she was gathering water and had a water bucket full of spring water. The spring itself was later canonized with her name. And she was walking along, and suddenly the rim of this old bucket that was enclosing the staves gave way, and all of the water splashed out and landed on the ground, and the moonlight that had been shining on the whole bucket was now gone. And this was the sudden triggering proprioceptive stimulus and noise stimulus and event stimulus that suddenly surprised Chiyono and triggered her enlightenment. This is a powerful reminder in the Zen culture that triggering stimuli can set off a genuine deep enlightenment episode. We know that this event occurred in the fall, perhaps right about this time. If you have persimmon trees in Charlottesville in the fall, there will come a time in which the persimmons themselves ripen. And you can see the persimmons here. These are some of the ripe ones. Persimmons take a very long time to ripen. This is no 8-week course of spiritual ripening that you get in mindfulness-based stress reduction. This is a long time to ripen. And if you've ever bitten into an unripe persimmon, you know that there is nothing as astringent and sit-backing as an unripe persimmon. And this is a metaphor for the way that long-term meditative training enables the bitterness that one has and the coldness interior that one has to give way to a more graceful state of and a sweetness, if you will, of the personality. So this is ripening time, and this was certainly a ripening time for Chiono. If you visit Seattle, Washington, sometime, be sure to visit the Seattle Asian Art Museum, not necessarily the ordinary art museum, but the Seattle Asian Art Museum. And there you'll find a very interesting statue that dates again from this 13th to 14th century. If you'll notice the statue, you will see that this monk's garment is folded to suggest that he is indeed a monk in activity. And if you follow the gaze and the posture of his head and eyes, you'll see that he is looking up. And the title of this statue is The Monk at the Moment of Enlightenment. Another suggestion from the world of art that there's something unique and special about looking up at the time that awakening strikes. This is getting somewhat suggestive, and one wonders, certainly as a neurologist, what might be going on here. So here's how a neurologist wonders, and I present to you in rather facile fashion, shortly, some of the thoughts that have occurred in my own thoughts on the subject. What does looking up have to do with enlightenment? What do triggering stimuli produce? Well, it starts with a difference between egocentric and allocentric attentive processing. Ego is clear enough nowadays, or should be clear enough. It refers to self, and egocentric refers to self-centered, often narcissistic, undesirable character traits that we'd all like to sort of dissolve away so our more angelic selves would shine forth. Allo is the counterpart word, another Greek word, standing for other. So anytime you use the word ego as a metaphor for self, you're talking about what's inside your skin, and anytime you're using the word allo, you're talking about a word that refers to everything outside your skin. This auditorium, this planet, this cosmos, you're inside this big other. When this subject looks out from his private sense of self at a single apple, the lines of sight of this apple come right straight back to his axial self. And he can reach out with his I, me, mine possessiveness and grab the apple if it's close to him. And that's one way of processing an apple that is voluntary, depends on a self-generated impulse, and has a contrasting mode of processing, which is allocentric processing. In the interim, this sense of self that we carry with us all the time can be broken down into its compartments. And these are the three ways that I, me, and mine operate in our ordinary world. Because the I, me, mine is a functional triad, which explains in adaptive terms that I exist, I feel, I know, I act as expressions of the I, of the self. In terms of me, things happen to me. These are things that more or less are centered in me, but these are centered elsewhere, and bad things happen to me. Automobiles can hit me as I cross the street. And mine is the grasping self. You really do grasp onto your thoughts. Your thoughts are hard to release. You own your body parts and you own your possessions, and you don't want anybody to steal them. And these ways of functioning and thinking go on all the time, relentlessly. They are expressions then of the maladaptivity, the maladaptive self. And this self can be overreactive and be aggressive, arrogant, can be besieged, battle, and fearful. The fearful self originates in me. Me is the part of the self that doesn't want to be hurt by life. Mine is an expression of the clutching, craving, captured self. Another way that the self gets in the way of our more angelic selves. And these maladaptive parts of the self, in turn, reflect an over-indulgence and an over-functioning limbic system, which, though it conveys good things and good feelings, also has a lot of negativity to contribute to the brain and to the way we think. So the I, me, mine is something we'd like to dissolve, at least in terms of its negative impulses. The other way of functioning that is not so self-referent is the other-referent self. And this is an anonymous functioning. I can't prove to you that you do have, at this very moment while you're sitting there, an allocentric self. But I can tell you that you could think about it as though somebody else were taking a picture of the world that you're sitting in, and not your lens was the focus of the processing, but somebody else's lens and somebody else's camera was taking a picture of the world, an objective picture of the world, not your usual subjective picture. So this is a pretty good representation of the world, but you're not in the picture. This is anonymous brain processing. And as you might suspect, this kind of processing is going on all of the time in your brain without your being aware of it, especially because it goes on in parts of the brain that don't have body representations to louse up this clear objective processing, and don't have limbic inputs to entangle it with emotions. This is your subconscious processing that goes on without your being aware of it. Allocentric processing. The brain is also organized into two major systems. One of them asks the question, where is it? The other asks the question, what is it? These are oversimplifications, but the where is it question asks really a longer sentence. It asks of the outside world, where is it in the outside world so I can reach out and grab it with my hand? And the what is it system looks out in the world through vision and through hearing and asks the question, what is it out there and what does it mean? When the where is it question is asked, the objective is to identify its position so it can be grasped with using touch and proprioception, things that you can reach out and engulf and eat or can write with, etc. But the what is it question depends on long-range perception that one gets when one looks out into the distance using vision and looks out into the distance using audition and hearing and says, what is it out there so I can be sure it's not out there to harm me, or what is it out there so I can finally get there and do something about it and eat it. So the where system is largely in the northern part of the brain. You're looking at a brain with the nose here, the back of the brain here, and the where is it in the egocentric system is largely pursuing a pathway that leads over the dorsal part of the outer cortex. And the what is it system is more ventral in location and comes through the temporal occipital region on the way to the lower part of the frontal cortex. Our top-down attention system are pretty much overlapped by these two pathways. These two systems in the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe help direct your attention down below the horizon, because as you know, things are crossed in the nervous system just to confuse the audience. So the top-down system operates in the bottom half of the visual field, which is below the visual horizon. And that's where your hand and eye coordination help you hold a baby and not drop the baby. And that's where if you're using a hammer to drive a nail into a plank, you're doing it down here and your hand-eye coordination is working well. On the other hand, if there's a saber-toothed tiger way off in the reeds at a sizable distance away, you'd like to be able to see the stripes on that tiger and differentiate those from the appearance of the reeds next to each other. You'd like to have color vision to see some of the orange in the hide of the tiger. And you'd like to be able to discriminate that beast far out with your distant early warning system. Because as soon as that creature becomes tangible to you, you're practically history and you won't venture into the gene pool. So if you've survived that and escaped from that tiger using your ventral attention system and ventral processing, you could then look out with calmness and awe at the mountains that are in the distance, occasionally snow-capped. You can look out at the distant clouds, and you can have a sense of awe at being out in nature at a distance from you. So we're seeing another practical illustration of the fact that what you see at a distance and what you process out at a distance above the horizon is very different in the brain from what goes on below that, which is close into you, which is what we call peripersonal space, egocentric space, close to your self-center. This is a functional MRI scan in two parts. We'll look at the upper part first. And it's designed to show that there are interior parts of the brain that are right along the midline of the brain, and there are more lateral parts of the cortex which are off to either side. You'll also notice that there are hot spots which are sort of reddish yellow, and cold spots which are more bluish in color. And the bluish spots, or the cooler spots, or the less active ones in this section, are the same areas that we saw as part of the top-down attention system, so that these regions are rather cool or inactive at the moment. Attention is relatively inactive. What else is more active in these functional MRI scans? Well, there are three areas that are the majority of the extra active regions. One of them is in the medial prefrontal cortex, which is right back here on both sides. And we're looking at the inside of the left hemisphere in this view. And the other is back in the medial parietal area, where the posterior cingulate cortex is, and the precuneus is, and the retrosplenial cortex is. And there's a third area up here in the angular gyrus, which is also involved in the processing of self, except these are involved not so much in the physical sense of self, but they're involved in the psychic sense of self. What do I mean by the psychic sense of self? Well, the somatic sense of self is your bodily self, and they're right next to the motor strip. And they're not part of what we're talking about here. We're talking about the sense of self that gives you an autobiography that you can think about or speak about when you're traveling and somebody asks you, where were you born? And immediately you can relate and rattle off a whole long history if you're encouraged to do. And that's your autobiography. And your sense of being a historical person is represented in these medial areas in your medial prefrontal cortex. But so what's going on back here? If you've ever visited a foreign country and kept a journal, you know that if you're, say, looking at a cathedral in Milan, for example, you yourself are in a certain part of that plaza before that cathedral, but that cathedral becomes part of your event topography. And you and that cathedral become part of that event. And this junction of self and other is sort of a self-othering phenomenon. You can't be yourself in your journal without identifying that spot where you experience something and writing about it as a spot. So your place in history is dictated by the scenery, the topography of the place that you were in at the time. And that's how you develop an event story that becomes part of your autobiography. So much then for the self-othering phenomena that take place normally when these three areas are active. What you're seeing here, however, is a functional MRI of normal subjects who are in a functional MRI scanner. Now, those of you who've ever been in a functional MRI scanner know that it's a very noisy place. And although the scanner people tell you to rest and be quiet, it's hard to do that with all the racket going on. And so your mind tends to wander, even though they tell you not to do anything, your mind still wanders. This is not a resting state. Although they say it, you're at rest technically. But what else goes on if you run that scanner for about 5 minutes, as was done here in 2005 by Michael Fox and Mark Rakel at Washington University in St. Louis. What you see here is that there are times in which this attentive brain, which is seen cooler here, goes up, and the attentive brain goes down. And there are times in which the self-other, hyperactive, self-centered brain goes up, and times in which it goes down. And the fascinating thing is that 2 or 3 times a minute on their own, as part of a slow cycle, the intrinsic rhythm of this brain goes in counter directions, such that the cold areas get hotter and the hot areas get colder in a reciprocal inverse fashion. Think what this means. It means that there are parts of your brain without your knowledge that 3 times a minute, say, are becoming more active in the areas where your psychic self lives, if you will, and at the same time, in the opposite direction, the parts of your brain that are more attentive, both your top-down and your bottom-up attentive brain, are becoming more activated. So there's this inverse reciprocal arrangement in which when the self is turned up, attention is turned down. But equally important, when attention is turned up, the representations of the self are turned down. And this goes on 3 times a minute without your being aware of it. What does that mean? What it means is important for another reason, which has to do with what happens when a very sudden stimulus occurs. You weren't expecting the bell to ring, so that was a sudden stimulus. But when a stimulus like that occurs in your auditory environment, or when a sudden visual stimulus startles you, the self-represented parts of your brain are turned down, and the attentive parts of your brain, of course, are turned on because the stimulus captures your attention. So here we have a brain that has a slow rhythm, 3 times a minute responsivity, and an immediate response when attention is captured. Think of what happened to Chiono when the bucket broke and crashed to the ground. What happens in this instance can be diagrammed as something like this. When your attention, external attention, snaps into attention, the representations of the self drop down, and vice versa. When your overweening self gets even more overweening, the modes of external attention in particular go in the other direction. How does the brain manage to do all this? And what goes on, and what does it have that might be important for meditators to know about? Well, let's look at this from the standpoint of a person. Suppose you've been at a meditative retreat for a week or so, and your whole perceptual apparatus is sensitized. So you're sensitive to stimuli of all kinds. And here's your egocentric and allocentric inverse reciprocal cycles of reactivity. Let a sudden stimulus impact this reciprocal relationship at a critical, pivotal time, and it's possible that the resulting imbalance would shoot in opposite directions in an overshoot, resulting in a marked reduction in self-centered processing and a marked accentuation in allocentric attentive processing. This would be a gap which would be empty of self, but full of the awareness of allocentric processing and all of the world around, at the same time that there was an absence of self back in the center. And this, you may recognize, is what we were talking about a few minutes ago. So, after that moment in which the self was out of the picture, but processing was still going on, but a distinctive kind of processing, then there is a period of recovery, after which there is very little in the way of egocentric processing for a matter of minutes to hours to a few days, but an increase in allocentric processing, which means a heightened awareness of the unity and oneness, a manifestation of the oneness of the whole cosmic world in which we're all tiny inhabitants. So this really amounts to a deactivation of self-referent processing and an activation of other referential attentive processing. A visual metaphor for this process would starting up here at the top, would have this expressing the big hypertrophy of our self-centeredness and our underappreciation of the other world that is surrounding us. We are really the most important person in the world. Don't kid yourself. We really are. Let that hypertrophy of the self vanish and let the allocentric processing per se take over the event. And you have not a dual world of self, other, but you have a non-dual world that is bigger than self, upon the emergence from which there will be a period in which the self itself is shrunken, and the allocentric world of awesome appreciation of the size of other people and other things is increased. And you'll have not the small impact of this small world coming through imperfectly, but you'll have a more porous relationship that allows the self to experience the greater importance of other people and other things, a visual metaphor of what we're talking about. Okay, well now I've been talking about a remarkable timed pivotal change in the brain that involves both hemispheres, that involves both the cortex and the subcortex, that goes in opposite directions. How is it possible that any structure in the brain could govern and allow these events to occur? A plausible explanation lies in a big central structure like the thalamus, which is in the central part of the brain. This is the left half of the thalamus, a paired structure. It lies deep in the center of the brain. And its connections between the upper or dorsal layer of the thalamus and the cortex are precisely arranged so that this dorsal part of the thalamus can inhibit those self-othering areas of the medial parietal and medial frontal region that we've spoken about before. So these oscillations that you see here diagrammed between the dorsal part of the thalamus and the cortex that we've been talking about allow the limbic nuclei of the thalamus, which receive a lot of this overactive limbic input, which we haven't diagrammed, but it all funnels through these three nuclei, allows the thalamus to activate or deactivate the very elements of self and other we've been talking about. How is this possible? It's only possible because capping this whole dorsal thalamus is a big, large in volume and area, but small in thickness. A nucleus called the reticular nucleus, which acts as an inhibitor and a filter. And this filter, when applied to the dorsal aspect of the thalamus, can actually shut down the dorsal aspect of the thalamus and block all the unwanted traffic that comes from the limbic system from overactivating the cortex of our self. So here's a way to shut down or shut off, if you will, unwelcomed limbic impulses. And this is one way, in fact, that the thalamus adjusts to overactive stimuli that capture our attention. So I've left some room here, since we're going at a cavalier explanation of the brain and an abbreviated sample of art and Buddhism. I've left room for some questions, and I hope for some answers, and thank you for your attention.